questions before we begin? All right, so the quiz is 5 questions, short essay, short brief. We'll make it brief. We'll start it at 8:20. It'll end at 8:50. It'll open up on Blackboard. So I'll stop lecturing at 8:20. You can start your quiz. It's not that difficult, right? 5 questions, kind of one from each kind of chapter that we went through. So use your notes, the notes that I've uploaded, or your textbook, so it shouldn't be that difficult. What I really want you to do is try in your best to relate it to sort of your personal observations, right? We've all had experiences observing others or children or parents or any of these things, right? So that's kind of what I'm looking for. All right, so in the meanwhile, let's continue on sensory motor reasoning, right? We're trying to think of theoretical framework, right? The big one is Piaget, Jean Piaget, the Swiss scholar, who kind of looked at all these different stages and sub-stages on how infants would reason. How does it all take shape for them to learn, to build their learning, thinking, cognitive abilities, primarily starting with using the physical body. Right? So what are we trying to understand here? Well, for all of us, right, little ones, infants, the motivation for pretty much anything, right, we can call a drive, right? And before I use this, a lot of psychologists don't like to use it. We'll call it drive, or we'll say motivations, right? What drives one to do anything, to learn anything, right? You need motivation in order to learn something. So for babies, as with us, we say pleasure, right? We are motivated and guided by pleasure, right? It just happens to be in a different way, because we've developed through time. So for babies, it's like they're seeking pleasure through physical experiences first, right? So it starts physical, and then it gradually moves towards, you could say, mental. What we can say really is external environment, right? How does this happen? Hey, it happens by chance. The baby begins to move his arms and happens to hit his face with his fingers, and it's like, oh wow, this feels pleasurable. I don't know why it feels pleasurable, but it feels good. I want to repeat acts of pleasure, right? It begins to figure out ways that it can seek this pleasure, right? By manipulating his body. Maybe it put his toes in his mouth this time, just by chance, right? So baby is developing a concept of things based on seeking pleasure, as we all do. We know that we are not stimulated. We are not stimulated unless most things are pleasurable for us. Even when we learn, when you hear me speak, you'll memorize 3%. You're like, why? Only 3. Because the rest isn't stimulated. And we say it has to be kind of familiar, something new and interesting, right? It has to be something for you specifically. That's why people question ADD, ADHD, right? They're like, oh, the person's just not stimulated by the concept. It happens to be a natural phenomenon. Same goes with baby. So we say baby begins to start with seeking pleasure, using his physical body, and then later on, the infant starts to have goals, right? And goals or drives, right? The motivation to achieve those things, right? First it starts off with the physical pleasure. It ends off with mental pleasure. So mental would be like the ability to just think on our own, without a physical experience, without anything in our environment to provide us pleasure, to just relax pleasure ourselves mentally. You're like, well, that's a big jump. That takes a lot, right? So here we're thinking of these theories, primarily Piaget. Right? Others are going to argue against Piaget as we learn. Some think that we're more like computers, right? You have a processor, you have long-term memory, which you consider a hard drive, short-term memory, which you consider memory from your computer, right? But Piaget's model is kind of what we focus on. So just briefly, going through what we already learned. All right, so we say schemas are concepts. Hey, the concept of moving my hand to grab the pacifier, put it in my mouth. That's a concept. Like, I want to repeat that concept. Now, if I see something larger and I try to grab it, put it in my mouth, I'm like, oh, it doesn't fit. It's too big, I can't grab it. New concept. Right? And then we have accommodation. So with this new information, we're like, oh, we have to figure out something new. We've learned something new. This big thing I can't grab and put in my mouth. This is a new phenomenon. This is something separate than grabbing a smaller thing. So we're learning things about objects, space, right, dimensions. Maybe even baby has dropped something and notices that it hits the ground, that it just falls, that it doesn't just float in the air. Like, oh, wow, that the new concept starts to emerge. Like, wow, these things fall to the ground. I wonder what that's about. And then we have cognitive equilibrium and cognitive disequilibrium. Basically stating that it's kind of like having stress or anxiety for an infant. So think of what anxiety is for us as adults. Who could describe it in some way? Who could describe anxiety? We all have it. It's a universal phenomenon. Everybody has anxiety. Anxiety is part of motivation. How would you describe it? Anybody? Yes.
Kind of like a way of being like overwhelmed.
Kind of, yeah, overwhelmed. Think of this, our minds are wired to try to predict based on what we already experienced. We're constantly trying to predict the next second, the next minute, the next hour, the next month, the next whatever, right? Like we're trying to predict them based on our experiences. But our experiences involves our senses. And our senses also have perception. And sometimes the perception is not a reality. And we saw with the sun, right? Sun is white, look in the night sky, the stars, right? It's yellow-ish. So you're like, oh, okay, we perceive it because of the spectrum of light, visible light is what we perceive, but in some truth is not that color, right? And so we have an anxiety when our expectations don't match the reality. So imagine if you found somebody attractive and you went to go talk to them, right? And you're confident that you could, talk to them or something, right? And maybe get them on a date, right? And you do all these different things, and you're so confident, and then you're completely shut down for whatever reason. You're gonna feel immense anxiety or stress because your perception even of yourself, of the environment, of the interaction, did not match your reality. Which means you may have to go back and change, accommodate some sense of reality about you. Maybe you were over eager, over motivated, might think too highly of yourself, right? We have to go back and alter this so that we can close the gap of expectation versus reality. And that's what anxiety is. So when someone has a huge amount of anxiety, they have a huge gap between their predictive expectation, what they think is supposed to happen, and then the reality when they get shut down all the time. Right? Anything in life, work, money, blah, blah, blah. Right? So that, in essence, truly is what anxiety is. Same happened here with baby. You say, we don't like anxiety. We move towards pleasure. We're goal-oriented towards pleasure. Don't let it fool you. Everything is goal-oriented towards pleasure. Anything that's not pleasurable, we consider some form of anxiety, right, or stress. And we move away from it, or we alter our perception, right? So that's kind of what cognitive equilibrium and disequilibrium is, right? It's having a healthy balance would be equilibrium, which is impossible. You never have some sort of base frame of reference. But you want to get it close. Disequilibrium is a huge spread between like, I don't understand what's happening here, and I just can't get it. Right? It's not making sense. All right, so we say, hey, it starts off with reflexes, innate, inborn motor skills, movements, some sort of innate skills, right? Then we got primary circular reaction. We learn as we repeat. We repeat it multiple times. It begins to take hold, and the theory is for Piaget that babies before 8 months don't really have long-term memory. Right? So saying, well, that's even questionable, right? But primary circular reactions, like baby in some way, the infant, has to repeat multiple times for it to keep becoming a schema, a concept, right? Or just touching something and having a sort of reaction, cause and effect. Secondary would be, think of his external environment. So now it's not about really pleasuring the body so much, it may be pleasuring the, say, visual perspective, like the little toys that they hang over the baby, and the baby starts to hit it, and it does it for hours because it likes it, right? In some sense, maybe it's physically pleasurable in a sense, but baby likes looking at it. It's like, yeah, I like this visual thing in the external environment. I'm not necessarily focused on putting the binky in my mouth, which is my internal sort of pleasure. But the outside world. So now we start to see slowly but gradually the baby starts to focus outside of itself. Slightly, right? Slightly. Starts to get pleasure by secondary. Right? And then you say, hey, it starts to coordinate circular reaction. It starts to alter its movements and behavior to have those pleasurable things in the outside environment happen. And then we have mental representation and tertiary, right? This starts to take shape as baby begins to have some sort of mental pleasure about things that are happening, which we begin to see the development of almost like abstract thinking, right? Just kind of thinking on its own, thinking without objects being around, right? Thinking without, slowly. Okay, object permanence, right? So infants under the age of 8 months, Piaget theorized that they don't have the concept of object permanence, which means once the object leaves the physical space, baby believes it doesn't exist, right? So, for example, you could hold like a box up to a child and show it to the other, and show it like a doll, right, right from his face, and then you can slowly move it behind the box, and baby's mystified, right? It thinks it disappeared, it don't exist, right? Well, that's a pretty interesting phenomenon, because once again, we saw with attachment, right? We're like, hey, you know what? If babies have this lack of object permanence, something exists, even without seeing it physically in front of your eyes, right? You know the sun's gonna come out tomorrow, you don't need to see it. Then how does that shape form into like attachment and trust? Right? So that's kind of correlated there with, hey, you gotta see it. And baby needs to physically see the people for it to actually think it exists, right? Mom, dad, whoever the caregiver is. And A not B era is basically correlated with the object permanence, and that baby can see things, move out of a space where it be hidden, like being covered up, and still looking for the object, but not understanding that it's disappeared in some way, like it was taken away, right? Even though it's seen it. Deferred imitation definition. Deferred imitation is like, hey, can we mimic something at a later date? If I experience observing somebody, can I imitate that? Because it's part of my own observational learning, right? Can I mimic things that I see, right? Which is important. So going against what Piaget was saying, because he didn't believe that babies have this storehouse of memories to a high degree. Some think that infants do act on memories, right? Because obviously if you have deferred imitation, you're able to imitate something at a later date. It has to come from memory, right? So we have to think, these are all theories, right? We can't say for sure. What we can have is kind of the best available knowledge, and Piaget kind of lays that out for us, right? And these kind of theories go against Piaget, right? Core knowledge theory. This theory is that babies are born with more exceptional skills than we kind of thought before, right? They are born with the ability to have memory, to think, right? They have a little bit of cognitive abilities when they are born, right? All right, and then lastly, we'll touch on this even more on Friday. But information processing, this is a theory that's, hey, babies are like computers, right? Sensory memory, which means we have muscle memory, so obviously baby can repeat things based on memory from muscles, right? We have organ memory. Everything we do and repeat stays in the storehouse of memory. We have working memory. Remember, working is short-term memory, right? Working memory is like, hey, can you quickly remember something for the quiz, right? You don't need to remember it for a long time. You just need to remember it long enough to take a quiz, or something, right? But it requires mental effort, which means you got to keep repeating it to yourself over. Central executive is basically, hey, the brain is some sort of central processing system, and that's how we sort of expand out our knowledge base. And then long-term memory, right? Long-term memory is permanent. Right? You do something enough times, you learn it. Like shooting a free throw, right? You're like, oh, okay, you haven't shot a free throw in 30 years. Shoot a free throw. You might not be good at it, but it takes a little more time, right? So if you don't use it, you kind of lose it. You never lose it forever, right? But your skill set can